Klayim Perik Daled Mishnah Aleph Karachas Hakerem B'Shama Oimrim Esrim Ve'arba Amos B'Thil Oimrim Sheshes Ve'Amos. Till now in the Masechta we were discussing the Hilchas K'lei Zroim, mixtures of grains, beans, and vegetables. The Hemshech of the Masechta is going to be talking about K'lei Hakerem, which were seeds planted in or next to a vineyard. The Isra of K'lei Hakerem applies only to grain and vegetables planted in or next to a vineyard. There's no Isra to plant fruit trees in a vineyard. The Torah lists K'lei Hakerem as a separate Isra, and indeed it is subject to different halachas, as we mentioned in the Hakdama to the Masechta. One of these rules is that grain and vegetables must be separated from a vineyard by 4 amos. 4 amos of empty space around the vineyard serves as a work area. This is the area needed for the grower to bring oxen to plow the ground around the grapevines and to walk with a wagon and oxen to harvest the grapes. A vineyard consists of at least 5 grapevines in a specific formation, as we'll see later on in the parak. Single grapevines require only a 6 tefach separation. This is the rule for planting next to a vineyard. However, if someone wants to plant another species in the middle of a vineyard, it's more chomer. And this is what we're going to be discussing in this Mishnah. So, karachas hakerem, the halacha regarding clearing in a vineyard, a karachas is literally the bald spot of the vineyard. This expression refers to an area in the middle of the vineyard that has been cleared of vines. So Beis Shammai say Esrim ve'arba amos, if there's an empty space of at least 24 amos, we may plant another species in the clearing. If the clearing cuts completely through the vineyard, so that it is now surrounded by only 2 sides by grapevines, the clearing must be 24 amos wide. If the clearing is completely inside the vineyard, so that it's surrounded on all 4 sides by grapevines, we need a clearing of 24 by 24 amos. Okay. We do this by leaving a space of 4 amos empty next to each remaining side of the vineyard, and we may then plant 16 amos between them. The clearing must thus be 4 plus 16 plus 4, which is 24. However, if the clearing is less than 24 amos, there will be less than 16 amos between 2 work areas in which to plant. As a result, we may not plant anything. The reason for this will be explained later on in the Mishnah. Beis Hillel say Sheishes Re'ama, a clearing of 16 amos is enough. According to Beis Hillel, as long as we can plant 8 amos between the 2 work areas, it's enough. So according to Beis Hillel, the width of the clearing must be 4 plus 8 plus 4, which would be 16. The work area needed around the vineyard is considered part of the vineyard. No other species may be planted in it, because doing so is like planting in the vineyard. Since there is now a clearing dividing the original vineyard in 2, each side that remains is an effective vineyard of its own, and each needs its own work area. So Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that 8 amos, 4 on each side of the clearing, cannot be planted. That's l'kulei alma. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel also agree that the area we do plant in the middle must be large enough to be considered an independent field. If it's too small to be a field, it's considered insignificant, and therefore merely an extension of the vineyard and work area next to it where planting would be forbidden. What Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagree about is how big an area must be to be considered a field. According to Beis Hillel, in order to be considered a field, a planted area must be at least 4 amos wide. However, since the area being planted in the middle is sandwiched between 2 vineyards, it must be double that amount, 8 amos, that we have a field next to each vineyard. Otherwise, we would assign half the planted area to each vineyard, with the result that neither half would be large enough to be considered a field. This explains why the total clearing, according to Beis Hillel, must be 16 amos, a workspace of 4 amos next to one of the remaining sides of the vineyard. A planted area of 8 amos next to it, enough for 2 fields in the middle, and another workspace of 4 amos for the other remaining side of the vineyard. Beis Shammai, on the other hand, are of the opinion that a planted area cannot be considered a field unless it is 8 amos wide. Since we must have a field for each remaining vineyard, the area must be planted between them at least 16 amos. So according to Beis Shammai, the clearing must be 24 amos wide before we may plant in it, with a workspace of 4 amos next to one of the remaining vineyards. So a planted area of 16 amos, enough for 2 fields in the middle, and another workspace of 4 amos on the other remaining side of the vineyard. Mechoil hakerem. The Mishnah discusses a similar halacha. This one's relating to a gap between a vineyard and the wall that surrounds it. So Mechoil hakerem, for the law of the perimeter of a vineyard, is as follows. This refers to the empty space between the edge of a vineyard and the wall surrounding it. So Beis Shammai say Sheishes Re'ama, there must be an empty space of at least 16 amos between the vineyard and the wall that surrounds it before we plant any other species in that area. Beis Hillel say Shtemes Re'ama, an empty space of 12 amos is enough. 4 amos must be left empty next to the edge of the vineyard, because that's what that must serve as the work area, as we mentioned before, and it cannot be planted. The area beyond those 4 amos may then be planted, only if it can be regarded as a field in its own right, as we mentioned before. However, in the case of a vineyard surrounded by a wall, the 4 amas nearest to the wall cannot be counted as part of that field because people do not plant within 4 amas of a wall. This area was generally left empty so that people could walk there and compact the soil around the wall's foundation to strengthen it, like the Gemara explains in Vav Basa Daf Chav Beis Amud Beis. The area that we plant with another species must therefore lie between the 4 amma work area and the 4 amma path next to the wall. Since it must be considered a field in its own right, it must be 4 amas wide according to Beis Hillel and 8 amas wide according to Beis Shammai. So the space between the edge of the vineyard and the wall must be 12 amas wide according to Beis Hillel, which would be 4 plus 4 plus 4, meaning you would have 4 amas of a path and 4 amas of where you could grow things, and then 4 amas that you need for the work area. And according to Beis Shammai, the part that you would work does not need to be 4 amas, it would need to be 8 amas. And according to Beis Shammai, you would need to have 16 amas. Here there is no need for the width of 2 fields in the middle, as there was in the previous case, because in this case there are grapevines only on one side of the clearing. That's the difference between the karachas hakerem and the mechol hakerem. Ve'ezehi karachas hakerem. The Mishnah is going to define what a clearing in the vineyard is. Kerem shacharv me'emtzoi. It refers to a vineyard that was destroyed in the middle. The vines in the middle of the vineyard were destroyed or removed. So according to Beis Hillel, it's like this: Im ein sham shem esrei amas. If there if there's less than 16 amas of empty space between the rows of vines that remain on both sides of the clearing, lo yavi zera l'sham, he may not bring and plant seeds there. Seeds in this context refers to the species that may not be planted in a vineyard, which is grains and vegetables and the like. Hayu sham sheish esrei ama, but if there are 16 amas there, noisin la'avedos of zereas hamoitzer, we give the vineyard its work area, which is 4 amas on each side of the clearing next to the vines that remain, and he may plant the rest of the clearing, the remaining 8 amas, with seeds. This would be l'shitas Beis Hillel, because halacha would be like Beis Hillel. Mishnah Beis. Ezehu mechol hakerem. So mechol hakerem that we mentioned in the first Mishnah. So what is this? So bein kerem legeder. It's the unplanted area between the vineyard and the wall that surrounds it. So according to Beis Hillel, this is how it's going to go. Im ein sham shtem esrei ama. If there's less than 12 amas there between the vineyard and the wall, yavi zera l'sham, we may not bring and plant seeds there. Hayu sham shtem esrei ama. But if there were 12 amas between the vineyard and the wall, nice and le'avodasa, we give the vineyard its work area. That means we need to leave at least 4 amas next to it empty. V'zereya as hamaiser, and we may plant the rest of the space between the work area and the wall with other seeds. That is, he may plant even the 4 amas next to the wall if he wishes. However, he's not required to plant the 8 amas between the work area and the wall. He may, if he wishes, plant just the 4 amas next to the work area, but if he wishes to plant anything, he must plant those 4 amas next to the work area in order for the planted area to be considered a field of its own. The 4 amas next to the wall cannot be counted towards the field. Mishnah Gimel. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ein ze ela geder hakerem. In the previous Mishnah, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel disagreed about how much empty space is needed before we may plant seeds in the area of surrounding a vineyard. The Tana of the previous Mishnah defined this term to mean the area between the end of the vineyard and the wall around the vineyard. The Mishnah is going to bring another opinion regarding the definition of the mechol hakerem. Rabbi Yehuda says ein ze ela geder hakerem. This case that you describe as the mechol hakerem, the perimeter of a vineyard, is actually called nothing other than the fence of the vineyard, and does not need 12 amas between the vineyard and the fence in order to be able to plant there. According to Rabbi Yehuda, when Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel spoke of the perimeter of a vineyard, of the mechol hakerem, they did not mean the area between the edge of a vineyard and its wall. That area is called the geder hakerem, not the mechol hakerem. Therefore, the area between the edge of the vineyard and its fence is not subject to the halacha that you need 12 amas of space for the mechol hakerem, according to Beis Hillel. According to Rabbi Yehuda, even if there are just 6 amas between the vineyard and its fence, we may plant seeds in the last 2 amas next to the fence. Ve'ezehu mechol hakerem. So when does it become a mechol hakerem that you need to have 12 amas according to Beis Hillel? Bein shnei hakramim. It's the empty area between 2 vineyards. Since this area lies between 2 vineyards, we must leave 4 amas for each vineyard as its work area, and an area of 4 amas between 2 plants, so that it can be considered a field in its own right. However, it does not need an area of 2 fields in between, which would be 16 amas, as was required in the case of a karachas hakerem. This is because the area between the 2 vineyards in our Mishnah was never part of the vineyard. The clearing, the karachas, though, was once part of the vineyard, but its vines were destroyed. Therefore, a larger separation is required. The Tana of the previous Mishnah does not make this distinction and considers the area between 2 vineyards to be the same as the clearing of 1 vineyard. He therefore requires a separation of 16 amas even in this case. So ve'ezehu mechol hakerem. So ve'ezehu geder shehu gavoya asara tvachim v'chritz shehu amek asar v'rochav arba. The Mishnah now explains what kind of fence serves to separate a vineyard from the area beyond it in regard to klayim. This allows a person to plant seeds on the other side of the fence, even within the 4 amos of the vines. Although the Mishnah already taught these measurements in Parak Beis, that was in regard to separation between 2 species of plants. Our Mishnah teaches the law for separating between a vineyard and other species. Ve'ezehu gather what's considered a fence in regard to kilei hakerem, shehu gavaya asar tvachim, any wall that's 10 tvachim high. There's no minimum thickness for the wall. Even the thinnest wall or fence serves as a separation. There is, however, a minimum length. The fence must be at least 4 tvachim long. B'chritz shu amek asar v'rochav arba, or a ditch that's 10 tvachim deep and 4 tvachim wide. A ditch too can serve as a fence to separate between a vineyard and another species, but only if it's 10 tvachim deep and 4 tvachim wide. A ditch narrower than 4 tvachim across is too narrow to be considered a separation, since one can easily walk over it. And if it's not 10 tvachim deep, it's not considered a mechitza, so it's not going to divide. It's interesting because before there was no shear, and for the chritz it needs a shear because there's nothing physical that's separating it, just the area of space. But because it goes deep down, so that's why you need to have it 4 tvachim wide. Mishnah Daled. Mechitzas hakanim ein bein kana lachaver shloisha tvachim kidei shekanis hagdi hareze kemechitza. A partition of standing sticks lined up one next to the other can serve as a fence under the following condition. If there's no gap of 3 tvachim between one stick and the next, 3 tvachim being enough room for a baby goat to enter, it's treated as a valid mechitza. A Halacha L'Moshe Sinai teaches us that objects that are less than 3 tvachim apart from one another are considered to be connected as though the space between them has been filled. This is known as lavud. A row of sticks stuck on the ground in space less than 3 tvachim apart is thus considered a solid partition. It's a solid mechitza. One may have a vineyard on one side of the sticks and plant seeds on the other side, even if there's less than 4 amos between the seeds and the vines. Since baby goats can get through a gap that's 3 tvachim wide with ease, sticks that are separated by this distance cannot be considered a fence. So more than 3 tvachim is not going to be considered lavud. V'geder shenifratz. The Mishnah is going to say a halacha for a fence that has holes in it, if a fence was broken open. So we're discussing here gaps that are at least 3 tvachim wide. If the gaps are smaller than 3 tvachim, the wall is considered as if it has no gaps at all because of the halacha of lavud. So v'geder shenifratz, if a fence broke open, part of the fence fell down or broke apart, leaving an opening in the fence. So the halacha is as follows. Ad eser amis harehu kapesach. Up to 10 amis, the opening is regarded as a doorway, and one may plant even opposite the open space. Doorways are a normal part of the fence, since there must be a way to enter and exit the enclosed area. Therefore, the doorways are also considered part of the fence, even though they are open, and they too serve to divide from one side from the other. For this reason, it's mutter to plant the different species opposite the open doorway of the vineyard, even within 4 amos of the vines, because you anyways have to leave that space open. Yes, and we can negate pirza aser. If the opening is more than that, it's more than 10 amos wide, it cannot be regarded as a doorway, and it's forbidden to plant seeds opposite the open space unless they are separated from the vineyard by 4 amos. If the gap in the fence is wider than 10 amos, it cannot be viewed as a doorway in the fence. Rather, it is used simply as an open area that's not part of a fence. If a person wants to plant seeds opposite this open area, he must distance it the usual 4 amos from the vineyard. The solid sections of the wall that remain on each side of the opening continue to serve as mechitzas as long as they are 4 tvachim long. However, they no longer form one continuous mechitza, but are considered separate fences. So a person is still permitted to plant different species opposite the standing parts of the fence, just not opposite the opening between them. Nifratu by pirtzes harbe. If there were many broken openings in the fence, these breaks were each of a size that would be considered a doorway, between 3 tvachim and 10 amos wide. Im ha'omen merubah laparetz. If the total amount of fence that is still standing is longer than the total amount that is open, mutter to plant alongside the entire fence, even opposite the open sections, since each of these breaks may be considered a doorway. But if the total amount that is open is more than the total amount of fence that's still standing, it's forbidden to plant opposite the open sections. If the majority of the fence is open, then the standing sections can no longer combine to be considered one long fence. Rather, each section that is still standing is considered a separate fence and a separate mechitza. So the breaks between them are not doorways, but simply a pirza, an open area. It's therefore forbidden to plant opposite the open spaces unless there's a separation of 4 amos. However, one may still plant opposite the standing sections, even though it's still considered Paras Meruba Lo Emet. Mishnah Hey. Hanotea Ashura Shal Chamesh Gefanim. The Mishnah quotes a machlekes regarding the minimum number of rows required for a group of vines to be considered a vineyard. The difference between a vineyard and a group of individual vines is in regard to the distance another species must be separated for them. For individual vines, a separation of 6 tvachim is enough. For a vineyard, a separation of 4 amas is necessary. If a person plants a single row consisting of 5 vines, Beis Shammai say it's considered a vineyard, but Beis Hillel say it's not considered a vineyard. Until there are 2 rows with a total of at least 5 vines. 5 vines are a minimum needed to be considered a vineyard. According to Beis Shammai, all 5 may be in 1 row. According to Beis Hillel, a single row, no matter how many vines it has, is regarded simply as a collection of individual vines. For vines to be classified in a vineyard, they must be in 2 rows, with 1 row containing 3 vines and the other containing 2. And that's how the Mishnah is going to refer to it. So Lefikach, Beis Shammai's ruling in the previous case is stricter than Beis Hillel's. According to Beis Shammai, since a single row is considered a vineyard, it's also to plant seeds within 4 amas of it. According to Beis Hillel, it's mutter to plant seeds just 6 tvachim, which is 1 amma away, since a single row is not considered a vineyard. So Lefikach, Hazareh Arba Amish Abakarim, if a person plants seeds within the 4 amma work area of a full vineyard and making the vineyard aser, so Beis Shammai say Kiddushur Achas. He asers only 1 row of the vineyard as klayim, since 1 row is enough to be classified as a vineyard. Beis Hillel Emrim Kiddush Deishuris, but Beis Hillel say he asered 2 rows, since 2 rows are needed to qualify as a vineyard. When a person plants grain or vegetables in the 4 amma work area around the vineyard, both the grapes and the grain or vegetables become aser behana, as if they were planted in the karam. However, this does not mean that the entire vineyard becomes aser. The Mishnah teaches that only the minimum area that can be called a vineyard becomes aser. Since according to Beis Shammai, even 1 row of vines is considered a vineyard, only the first row facing the grain or vegetables becomes aser. According to Beis Hillel, however, the first 2 rows become aser, since the minimum size of a kerem is 2 rows. Of course, any vines that are within 4 amas of a vegetable are forbidden no matter what row they are in. This halacha is learned from the pasuk that teaches the isser of kilei hakerem. The pasuk speaks of the vineyard becoming forbidden in the singular lashon, pen tikdash hamalei utuas hakerem, so that the growth of the seed not become forbidden along with the product of the vineyard. This teaches that only 1 vineyard becomes forbidden, not 2. In effect, the Torah teaches that a large vineyard with many rows of vines is to be viewed as a group of vineyards growing together. Thus, the only 1 vineyard that is within the 4 amas of the grain or vegetables becomes aser. The literal meaning of the word kiddush is to make holy. However, in the Mishnah here, and throughout the Masechta, as we mentioned previously, the word kiddush is used in a sense of making the fruit or produce forbidden bahana, as we explained in the Hakdama to the Masechta. Mishnah Vav. We learned in the previous Mishnah the minimum number of vines that qualify as a vineyard is 5. However, in order to qualify, the 5 vines cannot be scattered about, but must be arranged in a certain pattern. So the Mishnah is going to describe exactly what that pattern is. If a person plants 2 vines facing 2 other vines, and 1 additional vine sticking out like a tail, this is a vineyard. To qualify as a vineyard, 5 vines must be arranged in the following pattern. The first 2 vines in each row are planted opposite each other, while the 3rd vine in 1 row sticks out beyond the other, sort of like a tail. This follows the Shita of Beis Hillel in the previous Mishnah that a vineyard must consist of at least 2 rows. However, even Beis Shammai, who said that 5 vines may be in 1 row, agree that if the 5 vines are divided between 2 rows, they must be in the formation described over here. However, if he plants 2 vines facing 2 other vines, and plants 1 vine in between the 2 of the others, so that the middle vine in 1 row is facing the empty space between 2 vines in the other row, or 2 vines facing 2 vines and 1 vine in the middle, facing the empty spaces on all 4 sides of it. There are 4 vines forming the 4 corners of a square, and the 5th vine is in the center. Einoi kerem, it's not a vineyard. because the 5 vines do not qualify as a vineyard unless they have 2 facing 2 and 1 sticking out like a tail. So when the Mishnah says Eine Kerem, they're treated as individual vines for which 6 tvachim is a good enough separation, so there shouldn't be a problem of klayim. Mishnah Zayin Hanei Shur Achas B'Sech Shaloi. We mentioned in Mishnah Hey that 2 rows of vines are needed to qualify as a kerem, according to Beis Hillel. The Mishnah now discusses the case of 2 rows that do not belong to the same person. If someone plants a single row of vines in his own property, and there's also an existing single row of vines in his friend's property, one row contains 3 vines and the other contains 2, and they're in the proper formation to qualify as a kerem, that would be shtayim keneged shtayim achas yitzis anov, v'derech hayochid v'derech harav be'amsa, and there's a private road or a relatively narrow public road that's less than 8 amos wide that passes between the 2 rows. Both the private road and the public road are less than 8 amos wide. Since a gap of 8 amos would prevent the 2 rows of vines from combining to form a vineyard, although a road of just 4 amos serves to separate between different species of grains and vegetables, vines are classified as trees, and trees are more chomer and will require a larger separation for klayim. Together, where you have a fence that's less than 10 tvachim high, so mechitza that's less than 10 tvachim high is not a mechitza. The 2 rows combine with each other in order to qualify as a vineyard, since neither the roads nor the fence are large enough to separate between them. Although the rows belong to different owners, and furthermore, they are separated by a road or by a low wall, they nevertheless combine to qualify as a vineyard. It is therefore also to plant other species between the rows or within the 4 amos of any side of this vineyard. Surely they combine if there is no road or low fence between them. However, if the fence is more than 10 tvachim high, the rows do not combine with each other to form a vineyard because the fence 10 tvachim high separates the 2 rows from each other. A wall that's 10 tvachim tall serves as a divider even for trees, as was mentioned in Mishnah Gimel. Although the Mishnah speaks of a wall higher than 10 tvachim, the same is true even if it's exactly 10 tvachim high. Rabbi Yehuda Omer im ersan milmayla, if he intertwined them above the fence, which means that he raised the ends of the vines over the top of the fence so that they grew to be twisted together as is the way of vines growing, Harei elam etzdarfos, then even if the fence is higher than 10 tvachim, the vines combine to qualify as one kerem. The Tanna Kama, however, maintains that a 10 tefach wall is considered a divider even if the vines are intertwined over it, which would be a very big chiddush, because that means that the mechitza is going through the actual tree. And b'darech klal, we would say that the mechitza won't be able to divide the tree. The mechitza is here to divide between the 2 properties, and the mechitza is here to divide between the 2 spaces and the 2 areas. But over here, there's a chiddush, a very big chiddush. Yehuda is saying that the chiddush would be in the Tanna Kama, that even if the branches and the vines are intertwined l'mayla, they're still going to be considered the mechitza is going to work to divide in between. Mishnah Ches, hanetea shtei shuros. If a person plants 2 rows of vines, im ein beineim shmoina amos le'yavi zar l'sham. If there are less than 8 amos between them, the rows that combine with each other to form a vineyard, he may not bring seeds and plant them between the 2 rows. If, however, there are 8 or more amos between the 2 rows, the vines do not combine to form a vineyard. Instead, each row is regarded as a group of individual vines, and it's mutter to plant between the rows as long as one stays 6 tvachim away from the other row. For example, if there are exactly 8 amos between the 2 rows, a grower may plant the middle 6 amos of the 8 amma gap. Hayu shalosh, if there were 3 rows of vines, if there are less than 16 amos between one row and the other row to combine to make a vineyard, he may not bring seeds and plant them between the rows. By planting his vines in 3 rows or more, the grower shows that his intention is to plant a large vineyard rather than a small group of vines. Therefore, the rows combine up to a distance of 16 amos. This is based on the fact that we find elsewhere that rows up to 16 amos apart combine to form a vineyard and prohibit planting between the rows. This is in the case of a clearing in the vineyard, karachas hakerem, where it's forbidden to plant between the remaining rows unless they're 16 amos apart. For this reason, when it's clear that the grower intends to plant a large vineyard with rows separated by this amount, the Chachamim ruled that they combined up to a distance of 16 amos. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer Mishum Chanina ben Chachinoi. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says in the name of Chanina ben Chachinoi, Afilu Chorva Himtzois, even if the middle row of a 3-row vineyard was destroyed, Ve'ein bein shur lechaverta sheish esrei amma lo yavi zara l'sham. If there are less than 16 amos between one remaining row and the other, the entire area is considered a vineyard, and he may not bring seeds and plant them between the rows. It shall follow from the previous halacha that if there was a 3-row vineyard whose rows were planted within 8 amos of one another, and the middle row was destroyed, we should treat the remaining rows the same way as if there were only 2 rows to begin with. So if the gap between them is now 8 or more amos, it should be mutter to plant between them. This is unlike the case of a karachas hakara mentioned in the first Mishnah, where it's forbidden to plant in the middle unless there's a gap of 16 amos. Over there, the sections that remained after the middle was destroyed were big enough to qualify as a vineyard in its own right, since at least part of the original vineyard continues to be a vineyard, even after the destruction of the middle. So it's easier for us to continue considering the rest of the area, including the destroyed section in the middle, to still be part of a large vineyard. Here, however, when the middle row of 3 is cleared, only 1 row remains on each side. Since neither of these is big enough to be considered a vineyard of its own, we do not have anything called a vineyard left in this area unless we allow the widely separated rows that remain to combine. So according to the Tanna Kama, we do not do this. This is true, even though he planted only just 2 rows to begin with, it would have been permitted to plant between them in a gap of merely 8 amos. According to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, once an area has qualified as a vineyard, it continues to be regarded as a vineyard even after the middle row has been destroyed, unless the remaining rows are 16 amos apart. In other words, the rule for karachas hakaram applies even when just a single row remains on each side. Mishnah Tes. Hanetea is karmoy sheish esrei amma mutter lahavi zara l'sham. The Mishnah continues the halacha of a vineyard that has 3 or more rows. If a person plants his vineyard with rows of vines at distances of 16 amos from each other, he's permitted to plant them there, to bring seeds and plant them there between the rows. Since the rows are separated by 16 amos, they do not combine to form a vineyard. It's therefore mutter to plant between the rows as long as he doesn't plant within 6 tvachim of any of them. Even though he intended this to be a vineyard and planted many such rows, it's still permitted to plant between the rows since they're separated by 16 amos. That's going to be mutter. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ma'aseh b'Tzalmud happened in a place called Tzalmud be'echad shanot as karmel al sheish amma. A certain person planted his vineyard with rows of vines at a distance of 16 amos from each other, and he wished to plant seeds between them. However, he was concerned that the vines would hang over the seeds and asser them. It's forbidden to plant seeds under an overhanging grapevine, even if the seeds are a proper distance away from the base of the vine, as we'll see in Perek Vav. To avoid this problem, he would turn the end of the vines of each pair. The sar, which is literally hair, is the way the Mishnah is referring to the vines, because they're hair, and it's like curly hair that gets tangled in everything. So to avoid this problem, he would turn the end of the vines of each pair of rows in the same direction, facing each other across a 16 amma space between them. Vizereya as hanir, he would then plant seeds in the plowed area between each pair of rows. B'shana ha'acheres, the following year, he would turn the ends of the vines towards a different place, in the other directions, facing each other over 16 amma space he had planted with seeds in the previous year. Vizereya as habur, and then he would plant the other species in the area he had left unplanted the previous year. In order to prevent the soil's nutrients from becoming used up, the grower wanted to avoid planting the same 16 amma area each year, as was the derech, as was customary at that time, that they would plant each field every other year, or every 2 years, or every 3 years. He therefore turned the vines over the spaces he had planted the previous year and planted the spaces he had left unplanted that year. For example, one year he planted this, area 1, 3, and 5 with seeds, and the next year he planted 2, 4, and 6 with seeds, if there were 6 patches in the field. This matter came before the Chacham at that time for Shiloh, and they said it was mutter. So we see from the story that when there are spaces of 16 amos between the rows of the vines, the rows do not combine to form a vineyard, and other species may be planted in those spaces. And this would be a raya to the halacha that was mentioned in our Mishnah. Reb Meir Reb Shimon say, Afa netea es karme al shmeina amos mutter. the Tanna Kama said that if the rows of a large vineyard are separated by 16 amas, it's mutter to plant seeds between the rows. So now we're seeing a different shita that Rameh and Reb Shimon say that somebody who plants his vineyard with rows of vines that are at a distance of 8 amas from each other, is mutter to plant seeds between the rows. Rameh and Reb Shimon argue on the Tanna Kama. According to them, even when the grower clearly intends to plant a large vineyard with many rows, 8 amas is enough to separate them and prevent them from combining into a vineyard. The halacha we learned in Mishnah Aleph that requires a separation of 16 amas before planting in the middle, karachas hakaram, applies only to a vineyard whose middle rows were destroyed. Since that area was once a vineyard, it remains a vineyard unless there is a space of 16 amas. But to become a vineyard in the first place, the rows must be less than 8 amas apart. If they are separated by 8 amas, they do not combine to form a vineyard. Ad kan.